I am the chief economist at Redfin. As the chief economist of Redfin, I study the housing market and I direct our economic research team in coming up with research that is relevant to the housing market, to home buyers, sellers, real estate agents, and basically anybody who is interested in following it. I speak regularly on topics like housing affordability and other housing market topics. And before working for Redfin, I worked for Amazon as a senior behavioral economist. So a land value tax is basically the idea that you extract the value of the land and redistribute it back to a community because nobody really owns the land, right? I mean, I guess maybe that's debatable, but it's based on the idea that we all collectively own the land. And so if you build on a certain plot of land, you should be paying some kind of rent for using that land. Anything you do in terms of the structure would be yours. We wouldn't tax that with a land value tax as opposed to a property tax. So you can build whatever you want, but the land value has to be shared. And the way that that can actually combat NIMBYism is that you would want to get the most value out of your land by building perhaps more housing on your land instead of just letting the land stay as a single family home. And if you didn't want to do that, then you would more likely want to move somewhere else where the land value tax was lower, where you wouldn't be impeding on other people's ability to get the full value of the land. NIMBYism is, it stands for not in my backyard. Back in like the 1970s, it referred more to things like industrial projects going in a neighborhood, but then it kind of evolved into residents really being opposed to any kind of development in a neighborhood. So you buy a home in a certain area, maybe all the homes are single family homes. There aren't any shadows in your backyard from taller buildings. You have a view of, say, the lake. Nothing's blocking it. And then you start lobbying to protect that, to make sure that no large apartment buildings go in that might block your view or cast a shadow, even if it means that housing for everybody else is unaffordable and inaccessible. So it's kind of just basically a shorthand for, I think, being kind of selfish, valuing your property value, your view, your neighborhood character that you want more than building a neighborhood that is welcome for all people or for more people to be able to afford and live in. So unfortunately, NIMBYism, it's like a consequence of, I think, incentives. Homeowners are incentivized to protect themselves, not to think about things more at a larger level. We could address that. I'll pivot with a land value tax.
So it sounds like there's kind of a different incentive structures. So if we tax property, then we'll get less productive uses out of the land. And if we tax the land, we'll get less speculation. Is that like a fair framing of what you're describing?
Yes, I think less speculation because the value would be extracted. It wouldn't be something that you would bet on. And I think that is more equitable just in terms of like how we distribute the value of land. It's not all going to the people who are just around earlier to buy it before the value went up. The value would be more reflective of all the people who contribute to that value. Because like, if you're in a place that has really exclusionary zoning, say San Francisco, for example, and you bought your home, let's say in the 1970s, the value of that land today is mostly attributable to the tech sector, and you personally buying a property, like you didn't contribute to that necessarily. So redistributing it back to the whole entire city would make that a bit more fair.
Now, Daryl, you're chief economist here at Redfin. So as an economist, what led you to these policy conclusions? What's the theoretical basis for them, and how did you personally encounter them?
So at Redfin, as the chief economist, our team, the economist team, studies the housing market, and our directive is to just inform people on what's really going on. So just telling the truth is a big part of what we do. We do the research and then we report on it. We try to report on it as factually as possible so people know what they're getting into when they buy a home. They understand why values keep going up, why housing affordability keeps getting worse. And you can't really explain that without talking about things like NIMBYism or property tax structures. These are the root problem. These are the root thing or policy choices that have gotten us into the situation that we're in today.
The other half of your policy proposal is property tax reform. And I've seen some property tax reformers who are also land value tax advocates advocate for what they call a revenue neutral property tax shift. And the idea here is if your local appraisal district or property tax district collects $1 million, because that's the budget, then you just assess the value of the land, ignore the buildings, and collect the same amount of money, but just from the land this time. What do you think of that kind of proposal? Do you think that's something that could be an easier sell? Or have you ever heard that specific policy proposal proposed before?
Yes. I think that where I want to learn more is that part of assess the value of the land, because I think there's a lot of hand waving that goes on at that step. And it would be a big burden bureaucratically to assess the value of the land. I mean, we already have property taxes. So obviously we're like capable of estimating land value or property value. But if that's going to be a major way that we solve this problem, I think we're going to have to be pretty careful about how we assess land value and try to think through that. So here's why I think it's hard. Land value isn't fixed. It can change. Things like air quality would affect it, access to jobs, access to parks. It's subjective. You could include non-monetary or non-pecuniary, like dollar value things in it, like how much carbon could potentially be captured if this land was turned into a park. How much do we value carbon then? Like you can go down a lot of rabbit holes when trying to figure out how to assess land value. And not to say it couldn't be done, but I think it's a bit more subjective than just some, professional appraiser coming in and putting a dollar value on it. It gets kind of complicated.
I've seen, you can go into San Francisco and you can find an empty lot next to a $3 million home that's worth like 2.5 million. And it seems like the dirt's probably for both of those is probably worth 2.5 million. How close do you have to get? I mean, you don't need to do 100% tax on the land rental value. What's your margin of error? I mean, you don't have to put a number on it, but just like, can we put in a policy that's good enough even in the face of imperfect information?
I absolutely think that we can do better. And there's like a lot of just small ways that we could do better. One is like getting rid of something like Prop 13 that caps the increase in your property tax. We could try to value the land instead of the structure and not tax the structure. So we're not taxing investment. I feel like it would, like the current system is very flawed and we could do a lot of improvements. And then another option for municipalities besides land value tax is leasing land more often, because it's in effect the same thing. Like instead of giving a plot of land away to a developer, you just set a rent and then the city can charge the rent that they feel is appropriate. And they can even take auctions on the rent too. That's another way to assess the value, is to just have an auction and let the auction determine it.
I'm really interested in this talk about racial bias in assessments, right? So if we're basically trying to do is predict what a home will sell for, And so if all the people who are making offers are, well, frankly, racist, that might reflect, depressed value for this place, if racist people don't want to live here, so, but I guess in terms of like policy, which is the worst outcome? If it's like, okay, I valued your property at its low, it's like, well, you pay low taxes. I've seen some presentations on racial bias where the fancy guy's house who lives on a hill and it's worth $2 million, the property tax, it's like, oh, that land is worth nothing. So he pays like, not very, very little in property taxes. But this person here who lives in the projects, oh, that land's really, really valuable. So they're hit with this very high property tax. So, I mean, I was wondering if you could speak to that aspect of things where actually overvaluing your property can be a form of bias.
Yeah, I mean, when you're applying for a loan, you want your appraisal to be high, and when you're getting your property tax bill, you want your appraisal to be low. So there are different kinds of appraisals, and unfortunately for Black people, they get hit both ways. When they're applying for the loan, there's a lot of anecdotes about Black people having to like take down pictures of their family, have a white person stand in so that they get a higher appraisal when they're applying for a loan. But then when it comes to the property tax bill, on average, Black people are hit with higher property taxes relative to white homeowners, because of what we talked about earlier about white homeowners being more likely to appeal their appraisals when it comes to the taxes. So it can cut both ways. I think a land value tax, though, has the potential to correct for some of that innate injustice in how homes in Black neighborhoods are undervalued, because yes, they would get hit with a lower tax bill. And you could even have a negative land value tax. Like maybe a place like Flint, Michigan, we should be sending checks to compensate for the way that their land value was diminished due to the lead crisis.
Oh, interesting. So like you destroyed land value. So you need to like, it's like a, what do they call it? A Pigouvian tax when you pay for something bad you've done. I guess that's what a carbon tax is.
Right. Yes.
And land value tax has often been paired with what used to be called citizens dividend. It is now called universal basic income. Is that another thing you were gesturing at with like negative land value tax, or is that a separate concept?
I hadn't heard UBI linked to land value tax in that way. I consider them separate policies. I'm not sure. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah, that's just the historical single tax Georgist movement. They often were like, okay, we'll do a land value tax and we'll use it to fund a citizen's dividend. You know,
you could use it to fund all kinds of great things. I guess that's one good option, but there's a million options for what you could put the money into.
So one thing I'd like to pivot to is this notion of, I've heard this policy called value capture, which seems a lot like all the things you're advocating for, just in a specific use case. Like we put in that rail line, you know, downtown, or we put in some transit and the land values go up nearby, but for some reason we can't fund public works and they all go bankrupt and it takes forever. And so some people are saying we should capture the value of those rising land values by building public works. Are you familiar with those policies, and do you have any thoughts on those, of the whole value capture with public goods spending?
Well, the context I've heard it in is in inclusionary housing. So if you give a developer the right to build like a luxury condos, a certain number of the units have to be priced below market value, and that is like giving back a public good. I think that they are an imperfect solution, but if that is what is politically viable, then it's better than nothing. But I think that a land value tax would be more efficient, because when you have that kind of mandate of including affordable housing in the condo unit, you may be discouraging a developer from considering the project. But I guess you could argue that the developers will do it anyway. And if they are doing it anyway, then I guess that supports that idea.
If you, by affordable, you mean rent controlled, right?
Yeah, or below market value. Yeah.
So Daryl, one question is a big thing that often comes in with the intersection of, race and housing is this topic of gentrification. People move into the neighborhood and the prices go up, and there's tension between the current residents and the ones just moving in. I was wondering if you could talk about that, because sometimes it seems like, don't we want to improve neighborhoods, but how can we do it without kicking out the people who already live there?
Yeah, I don't love the term gentrification, because I feel like it's just used so much that it's kind of lost its meaning. I think that what it is actually describing is the vulnerable position that renters are in when land value goes up. Because if everyone all of a sudden wants to move into their area, they don't own the apartment or rental that they're in, they now have to move because they can no longer afford to live where they are. And that is a disadvantage that is only really borne by renters and not by homeowners. What's interesting about a land value tax is that burden would now be shared by both homeowners and renters, because the land value tax would go up when more people want to live in the area, because the land is more valuable when it's more demanded. So if we're trying to reduce inequality, I think that is another angle for why a land value tax would help the problems of gentrification. It wouldn't completely eliminate it, but I think it would make it so that the burden is not shared so unequally.
So, Daryl, you're chief economist at Redfin. Tomorrow I wave a magic wand and you're chief economist of the United States. What do you do?
I probably would start a commission to investigate a land value tax, because that wouldn't be a very popular position, because people wouldn't know what I'm talking about. But I think that is what I would do.
I don't hear most people talking about land when they talk about economics, at least not until recently. Mostly it's like capital and labor and interest rates and supply and demand. But like land seems like a relatively new part of the discourse to me. And I was wondering if you could situate what makes land special economically.
I feel like land was discussed a lot when I was in graduate school, because it's the perfect example of an inelastically supplied good. When you're going through like what is an elastic good versus an inelastic good, land is the prime example. It can't be created; it just exists. So its value is determined by demand, not by supply, because supply is fixed.
Yeah, I never got an economics degree, so I don't know what they're teaching in schools these days. But it's interesting to me because like the Chicago School of Economics is very associated to a ignorant layperson like me with this what's the guy's name?
Milton Friedman.
Milton Friedman, very libertarian, but I guess he was a land value tax advocate too.
Yeah, he understood economics. He was one of the best in terms of understanding economics. I don't agree with all of his views. I think sometimes he tried to apply economics to things that are more nuanced than that, probably require more of a sociological or psychological lens, but he definitely understood economic principles.
You know, there's been some other proposals I've heard where it's like, oh, we just need to ban like second home ownership, or we just need to ban, we just need to like have a vacant lot tax, or we just need to like ban corporate buying of homes and all these things. So regardless of like political viability, what do you think of that kind of approach versus the ones you've just advocated for?
I just don't have a lot of patience for solutions that aren't going to help. I feel like it's distracting. I don't know. I know people, it's an easy thing to want there to be some like boogeyman for the problems that we have. But I think a lot of it, like going back to the housing problem of everything, is that we just like aren't thinking about things in a rational way of what would be best for all of us, instead of like this narrow-minded view of what's best for us individually in the short run.
So what is, you'd mentioned before about solutions that are kind of equivalent to land value tax. You talked about like a government leasing, you know, in that case, it's like, well, the land value is whoever gets the lease, and that's the prevailing market price, that lease, I suppose. And then the tax agency just collects that. How does that work in practice?
So and like if you're just like blindly writing a check, it's the same. It's exactly, the land value tax is the same as a lease. You're just paying the government a fixed amount each month. You can call it a tax, you can call it rent, it would be the same. So we already kind of do that in effect with property taxes. So I don't think it's like too hard of a pill to swallow. I think if we try to raise them too much, it might face some political backlash, because I do think that, especially in America, people like the idea that they themselves own the property and not the government. And if you make it too high, maybe people will start to question whether they own it or somebody else does. But I think we already do it in small doses, so we could at least try to increase the dose. Texas does it, and they're like the super freedom libertarian state, right? So if they have some of the highest property taxes, I don't see why California isn't doing higher land value.
So there's YIMBYs, there's LVT advocates. We definitely, I'll just out ourselves. We're definitely
really
in that group. Yeah. You're talking to a pair of ardent Georgists here. You know, like we said before, we're working on an open source land valuation model, right? We have a grant from Astral Codex 10 to do it. And we were wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what locational factors have the greatest influence on land values. Like, where is land value the highest? And why? Like, people talk about like how LVT will ruin farmers. Like, is farmland out in the boonies particularly valuable, or is it really all about that urban land? What's the deal?
I do think it's mostly about urban land. If I guess we have to figure out, where does value come from? Is value the market price if nothing was built on it?
Yeah, let's use just the marginalist view of
Because
just like what people will pay
even
for.
Something like, because like land out in the boonies, one of the reasons it's not valuable is because there's no infrastructure connected to it. Like, you would need to like lay down the plumbing, you need to get internet connection. So I think that in and of itself presents an interesting problem. Like, one example is I would point to is South Lake Union. Before Amazon headquartered in South Lake Union, it was just like a bunch of warehouses. Nobody wanted to live there. And then Amazon moved in, they created all these jobs, and the land value went up. So in a world with a land value tax, would you charge Amazon for that? I guess maybe you would have to give them the negative land value tax at first to incentivize them to come in. And then, you know, once they do what they do, then you increase it. But I think that some land value tax advocates hand wave away where land value comes from and how it's endogenous. So that's something that I would be really interested in researching and finding out more about.
Okay, so is that kind of like similar to the argument of it's like, okay, this value, this land could have this value, but it's oppressed by zoning right now. And so if I can buy it up and then repeal the zoning, then poof, the value will go up because now you can build this on it. And so the kind of the value goes up. Was that kind of what you were talking about just now?
Yeah, it's just that land value is mutable. Like it's sometimes a
Right.
policy choice. Sometimes it's based on just the whims of whoever decides to set up and invest there and build out
Right.
jobs or investments or whatever it may be.
Let's do it a little narrowly then. So forget like Marxist theory of value or marginalist theory of value. Just I'm trying to predict the price that this would sell for in the market, you know, assuming we restrict that just to land, right? What factors drive that? Is it just like you go near the city center and line go up, or what's the nuance?
I think if I was to create a function of it, the things I would want to put in my function, in my equation would be access to jobs, access to green space, access to transit, environmental factors like air quality, weather, demographics, because the people, I mean, a lot of the land value is who lives there, who like you want to move to New York because you want to be around people who live in New York and in the industries that are there. You move to LA to be in the entertainment industry. So demographics would be part of it too. That's where I would start.